All right. Good evening, everybody. I think people are trickling in. Let me just see here. We're just at about 7 o'clock. We'll give people another moment or two to join us. But I really appreciate everybody taking time out of their day to learn a little bit more about the art of the selfie. I'm so happy to see familiar faces here. Um, Lita's so sweet, says she looks forward to the last Thursday of the month. I always do too. Joe Birch, thanks for being here too. I think we are in webinar mode tonight. So everybody who's joining, please feel free if you'd like and if you feel comfortable to put where you're joining us from in the chat, and that will be the best way to send messages along. You can also use the Q&A. As is tradition, I usually talk pretty much straight through an hour, but if you don't want to hold your question till the end, you can always share it in the interim. I think the Q&A is probably the best way to do that. It's less distracting to other people. I don't think they get like the little pop-up there. So great to see so many familiar faces or familiar names, I should say, coming up. I feel like I know everybody here. Thank you so much for joining us. Um, Happy summer, everybody. Are we ready to get going? Okay. Welcome to the Art of the Selfie. My name is Jane Oneail. I am very grateful to Chelmsford Public Library and our partnering institutions. I think we have Tewksbury, Groton, Ashland, and Amesbury as partnering libraries tonight. And I'm grateful to all of you for taking time out of your day. Now, my background is in art history and in education. It is my absolute joy and delight to be able to share these programs with you. This is a brand new program for this month, and I've had a lot of fun sharing it with audiences. So thank you again for being here. We're going to dive right in because we are living in the golden age of the selfie, right? I can pretty much guarantee you that almost everybody here has taken a selfie before, and we all sort of know the best angles, maybe even the tools to edit and to create, you know, a preferred image of ourselves that we can share with our friends and family. But the modern selfie really stands on the shoulders of the traditions of portraiture that exist in painting, especially going all the way back to the Renaissance. So today we'll be exploring the many ways the self-portrait has been constructed over the years and how they reveal sort of the internal life of the artist, how they wish to be seen, how they wanted to be understood, and most importantly, how they wish to be remembered. So we will be getting back to the sweet little face on the screen in just a moment. I do have a quick preamble for us tonight. And it starts off with this consideration of like, why are we starting in the Renaissance for tonight's program? Because I do have a medieval era self-portrait on the screen for us. This is a medieval illuminated manuscript from the 12th century, and this is in fact a self-portrait. You can actually see the artist with his tools here. These are like his pots of paint, his little knife that he would use to make erasures, and here he has just signed his name. Now, it's really sweet to kind of get this little insight into the life of an artist working at this time, but it's hard to believe that he's produced an effective likeness to give us insight into who he is beyond really the tools of his trade here. But what we start to see in the Renaissance and beyond is this interest in an individual's full humanity and a scientific observation of their likeness and the attempt on the part of the artist to capture both the likeness and the character, the true character of that individual in paint, which I think is such a fascinating challenge. This is a self-portrait from an artist, a lesser-known artist named von Ameling from the 1800s. It's not a Renaissance era painting, but I just love the kind of cool calculation he's using in order to assess his own likeness and then capture it on a canvas. And that's kind of how we're going to move through this first section here, because I'm eternally fascinated by the way artists assess themselves in a mirror. I mean, there's almost always a mirror involved, right? And then how they translate that to a canvas. These are two, to me, very similar self-portraits, separated by about 500 years. This is the presumed self-portrait of the artist Jan van Eyck from the early 1400s. And over here we have Lee Krasner from the early 1900s. And in both pictures, we can imagine that the artist is gazing at themselves in a mirror and then turning their face ever so slightly to work on a canvas. There's this kind of wonderful triangulation of artist, mirror, and canvas. We'll be talking a lot about that tonight. And if you think about it, painting a portrait, painting a self-portrait is probably when your subject moves around the most. You can't keep still as you're painting a self-portrait. And I see this really interesting constraint, I would say, in both of the faces of our self-portraits here. The artist attempting to sort of hold still, but also really sort of create this well, they've created these penetrating gazes that say that, to me, that they're not trying to just represent a likeness, but maybe give us some sort of insight into their internal workings as well. Now, staying with this notion of the triangulation here, the artist, the mirror, the canvas, we have a slightly different setup with these two self-portraits here, which again are separated by about 500 years. We have a lesser known artist on the left from the 1500s. His name is Michael Ostendorfer. And then over on the right, we have Horace Pippin, an American artist. And the big difference here is that the artists are not looking at us, even though they've created their own likeness, even though we know they had to examine themselves with that same penetrating gaze in the mirror. They've shifted the gaze, and it creates a new dynamic between the viewer and the subject, the self-portrait, really. So what I want to draw your attention to, particularly with this image on the left here, is the fact that the artist, in addition to holding the tools of his trade, he's holding a carnation. And so that signified that this was probably a wedding portrait, and he might have imagined creating a pendant portrait of his future bride where they might have been gazing at each other. But otherwise, why would an artist choose to look away from the mirror, from themselves, from their audience in a self-portrait? Well, I think sometimes that penetrating gaze can be a little too intense. And so it creates almost the sense that we're looking at a painted portrait, not a self-portrait per se, to just shift the eyeballs in that eye socket there. So I think, again, that's a calculated move on the part of the artist. And then this final category before we dive into the program proper is this more whimsical category here. I just love these two self-portraits. They're from the 1800s. And the artist Basile on the left and Therese Schwartz on the right have thought about constructing these self-portraits so that they're engaging with the viewer in really interesting ways, and therefore engaging with their mirrors in interesting ways, right? So Basile over here on the left looks over his shoulder at us. It's just like a simple, casual little glance, like maybe we've interrupted him at his work. Maybe we've said something kind of funny or interesting that's piqued his interest. But as a painting, it certainly piques our interest. We're sort of engaging with him in an unexpected way. And then Schwartz over here on the right, I find this image fascinating. She is the figure that's illuminated as though she's standing in a spotlight on a stage, sort of looking out for her friends and family, shielding her eyes from the light in this way. So her penetrating gaze, which she would have used to create her own self-portrait, becomes an interesting, almost quizzical gaze upon us, the viewer. And I think it really pulls you in such a dynamic and personal way. So there's all sorts of different approaches to this. That's just our preamble. Let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this hour together. There's that sweet face again. We will be getting back to him, I promise. We're going to start off with mirrors and self-reflection because that's at the core of a self-portrait, right? Then we'll turn our attention to the fact that so many artists are proud and showing off the tools of the trade in their self-portraits. So we'll be looking at paints and brushes and a peek in the studio. And then you have other objects that aren't necessarily associated with the work of an artist. And those are very careful selections on the part of an artist. So I've called them objects significant and symbolic. And then we have emotion and expression. So artists using the self-portrait as an opportunity to explore exaggerated or extreme emotion. You can probably already guess a few of the artists that are in that section. And then my favorite section, artists that hide their self-portraits in plain sight, going back to the Renaissance and the Baroque. These are really fun images. And then we'll wind up with a quick section on age and mortality and our conclusion here. So now we can finally turn our attention to mirrors, self-reflection, and that sweet little face that I've been teasing you with so far. This is a self-portrait by the Italian artist Parmigianino that dates to about 1524. And the artist was very young, very precocious when he painted this. He was right around the age of 20. And so what he's done here is he's used a reflective surface, a mirror, in this case, a convex mirror, in order to create his likeness. Now, first point of order, were mirrors everywhere in the Renaissance? Well, there were more of them than there had been in medieval times, but they were still kind of luxury objects. And certainly a little convex mirror would have been something that was like a rarefied object. You wouldn't find that in any old home. So Parmigianino is associating himself with luxury goods here, and he's using this opportunity to create his likeness in replicating the reflection on a curved surface, thereby creating the distortions in this interior space in his own self-portrait. Part of that is the room wrapping around this little angelic face of his, and then part of that is this huge elongated hand in the foreground, calling attention to the hand of the artist, the importance of that skill, that trade, that work that's involved in creating the very image that we're seeing. Now, one of my favorite details in this painting, and what a painting, right? I mean, this was his way of kind of introducing himself to the world. One of my favorite details is this little glimmer over here on the right. It is believed that that is actually the frame of the very painting that we're looking at over on the easel. So it's as though he's looking at in this curved mirror, and then he can turn to his painting. I'm not sure why it would already have the frame on it, but that's another story entirely. So he's reflecting on a creative and an ambitious way for a young artist to present himself to the world. Here's just another view of this painting. I want to give you the full sense that it's painted actually on a curved piece of wood. So it almost seems that when you're looking at it in person, you're looking at the very object, the very curved mirror that he had been looking at. It's almost as though you're looking at your own reflection when you look at something like this. So the illusion is complete. It's a great object. Now, not all of our mirrors will be curved mirrors, but just to sort of continue on with the theme, I have M.C. Escher's, one of his, several of his self-portraits on a curved surface, on a reflecting sphere here. This is from the 1940s. It's sort of like an updated version of that same theme here. We have the room wrapping itself around the artist. We have the artist's face at the center. Notice his face is much smaller here, and his hands, again, are enormous. He's made an interesting choice as an artist because he's really highlighting, drawing into focus here, the fact that his hands are busy at work making art. But interestingly, even though he's already created the whole design that we're looking at, the paper in front of him, he has chosen to leave that blank. I find these little choices so fascinating, right? All right, so we're going to move on. to a non-reflective or non-circular convex image now, mirror now to consider. And you know I would throw some Norman Rockwell in here. I think this is one of the most wonderful self-portraits ever created. And in so many ways, it really gets at the heart of what we're considering today. First of all, Rockwell gives us this triple self-portrait from 1960. He sets it up in such an unusual way. He's presenting himself from behind. I think most of us probably wouldn't consider that as our first choice if we were making our own self-portraits. But that setup, that composition allows him to highlight this triangulation of canvas, artist, and mirror here. And of course, he's playing the little joke of like looking in the mirror, which is its own self-portrait right there. But his reflection in the mirror does not in any way align with the image that he is creating on the canvas here. So lots of wonderful elements to this self-portrait, but it gives us that full setup that we have to consider as we're looking at all of these self-portraits today. Now, I have become very interested in the relationship, the visual relationship between Rockwell and Salvador Dali, because just 13 years after Norman Rockwell created this iconic work, Salvador Dali created his own self-portrait also from behind, also at an easel, also with his face on a reflective surface here. So Salvador Dali is the famous Spanish surrealist artist and known for his sort of dream-like images and his kind of over-the-top personality. So what we're looking at here is a self-portrait where he is shown in the act of not, I mean, the setup here is that he's not painting his self-portrait. He is supposed to be painting his wife, Gala, here. But strangely enough, she is also positioned so that we see her from behind as well. And she's sitting right in front of a mirror here. This is, I think, the most unusual setup I've ever seen for portrait painting. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that his wife's face in the mirror is kind of unresolved. There's a lot of detail missing. For instance, there's almost an entire eye that's missing. And even though Salvador Dali is positioned even further away from the mirror, his image is much more clear. So it's kind of like the illogical aspects of dreams themselves, right? Kind of coming into fruition here. And he is also pointing out that kind of unusual setup that Norman Rockwell had introduced just about a decade earlier. I'll zoom in on that mirror because that's really where his self-portrait is. And you can see sort of the lack of detail in her face and the amount of detail in his face. What an unusual picture, right? So the next image I'd like to share with you from this section on mirrors and reflective surfaces is from one of the leaders of the photorealist movement of painting in the 1960s and 1970s. This is Richard Estes' double self-portrait from 1967, I believe. And so what we're seeing here is an elaborate painting based on a photograph that the artist took. And I don't know if you can see him in there already or his double image, but Estes would start with a photograph and then make a highly detailed oil painting based on the photograph. And he was particularly interested in these kind of cityscapes that were abundant with reflective surfaces. So we're kind of peering into an empty or closed diner. We can see all these signs and logos through the glass of it. We can see the reflection of the artist himself here standing alongside his tripod. There's his camera. Have you found his second self-portrait? It's a little bit further in. It appears as though there is a mirror inside the diner on the back wall that's adding this kind of double layer of reflection here. So what a complicated image here. Now, it's hard to imagine that this is a self-portrait that gives us any insight into the artist, right? But I think instead, Estes is sort of pointing out how in the modern world, how identity is kind of sort of constructed and also reflected in the surfaces of modern life this way. All right, I have one last image for you in this section about mirrors and self-reflection. Prepare to be a little shocked, okay? This is a lesser known artist whose name is Hans Weingartner. This is painted actually back in 1932. And it's such a whimsical way to set up this triangulation of canvas, artist, and mirror. So you probably figured out how this is working, right? The artist is seated in front of his canvas, and instead of putting the mirror up next to his canvas, he's put it down on the floor. And here he is glancing down at his own likeness. We can see his foot is resting on the mirror. We can see the reflection of the underside of his naked thighs. He himself isn't necessarily naked, although all the parts of him that we can see are nude. And then we see him with his paintbrush in hand, maybe a Rockwell-esque pipe here as well, and the canvas just above his head in this particular instance. So now this is our opportunity to turn our attention to self-portraits that really focus on the brush and the tools of the trade in particular. We're going to turn our attention to the ways that artists emphasize their identities and their professions in their self-portraits. So we're going to start off with one of my favorites, this very early Rembrandt self-portrait. He was just what, about 20 something years old, 23 years old when he painted this. And I know a lot of you are familiar with this one because it's at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So there's so many things going on here. He's a young artist, he's an aspiring artist, and he shows himself in his studio. The studio kind of dominates, and this canvas that we can see from the backside also dominates. I want to point out how sort of spare this space is. There's no decoration or ornamentation or on the wall. It's just it's blank walls. There's no collection of objects. Later on, Rembrandt would become a real collector of stuff that he would use as props in his paintings. But now it's just this kind of sparse setting. And if you notice, he has left the edge of that canvas, this pristine white. So we get the sense that this canvas that he's about to work on is still blank. And here he is, this tiny little guy confronting this big canvas. And we can see his palette resting on his forearm. The brushes there that still look pretty clean to me. It's that moment of creative energy where you're about to cross this threshold into creating something out of nothing, right? It's a wonderful moment, but it's an interesting choice on the part of Rembrandt to use this giant canvas here. First of all, it's horizontally oriented. Most portraits are oriented vertically. So we get the sense that he's probably not about to paint a self-portrait. Whatever he's painting, it seems like a big commission, right? A big important work. But the actual object, the very painting that we're looking at sort of defies that logic because Rembrandt's self-portrait in this case is a tiny little painting. And so it reminds us that he was still such a young man when he painted it and probably didn't have huge canvases at this point, which he could use to just explore his own likeness here. Now, here is a contemporary of Rembrandt, another artist from the Dutch Baroque, sort of a lesser known artist whose last name is Guybrechts. And in this case, his studio is filled with everything, and that's what he has focused on here. We've got the tapestry, we've got the palette with the dripping paint. We've got brushes over here in his pipe. And the artist has actually included his own likeness. This is his tiny little self-portrait over here. And actually a little card that introduces him as a court painter, as an official painter to very important people. But here he's really showing off what he wants to tell us about himself is that that he can paint fabrics, he can paint a great floral still life, he can do a little genre scene, a landscape over here, and then even the drawings that are kind of tucked away over here on the left are anatomical drawings. So he is using this opportunity to show himself and his studio and to showcase everything that he's capable of. There's a lot of pride, I think, baked into an image like this, a lot of that trompe l'oeil element to the fool the eye element with these elements of the picture that kind of come over the ledge and into our space here. Now, I love these two self-portraits side by side here. We have an N.C. Wyeth self-portrait on the left, and then a French artist on the right, painted at the end of the 1700s. His name was Anton Graft. So what we see in both of these images is the artist presenting himself to us as he sits before a white canvas. In the case of Graff, he's got his brushes ready to go. N.C. Wyeth doesn't show us that. But in both cases, the artist is turned away from their work and looking back at us. And I just want to remind you about that triangulation once again. So if they're sitting in front of a white canvas, what exactly is the setup? Are there two easels and two canvases? How does it all work? Or have they just chosen not to put anything in that white space? Now, I think N.C. Wyeth's self-portrait here is really smart and really playful in a number of ways. He presents himself wearing this stocking cap, like a warm winter's cap here, and a scarf. And if you look closely, the the contours of that blank canvas kind of encapsulate him perfectly. In fact, if you were to crop out the rest of the interior setting here, it would just be N.C. Wyeth out in the snow on a cold day. And he very smartly, I think, includes the elements of his home or his studio just beyond to give us that fuller sense of himself as an artist. And it actually, I think, helps to make the work look a lot more three-dimensional too at the same time. Now, sometimes artists choose not to include a blank canvas like this. Sometimes, interestingly, they show themselves painting other things. So again, it sort of disrupts that assumed triangulation of easel, mirror, and artist. Now, again, is there another easel in the room? How have they made this decision to paint someone else while they are painting themselves? These are two French artists here. The male artist on the left, I might be butchering the pronunciation here, is named Renier. And then, of course, this is Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun over here on the right. In the case of both of these self-portraits, they are showing themselves painting one of their patrons. So that probably accounts for the detail of the face and the costume over here. But what a stunning portrait, right? A handsome young man, sort of looking kind of mysterious, all clad in black, glancing over his shoulder. Vigée-Lebrun, much more engaging. She's smiling out at us, and the likeness that she's painting is very faint in comparison to her own face. She is painting the Queen of France here. She's painting Marie Antoinette. And at the time that she painted this, Vigée-Lebrun had already escaped Paris. She had escaped France, in fact, because it was getting too politically hot. The writing was on the wall for the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette was still queen, but Vigée-Lebrun got out of Dodge, and she wanted to introduce herself to other monarchs and aristocrats around Europe. So why not paint your own likeness in the process of painting another monarch? So this was a great way for her to showcase her talents. Now, I know many of you have explored this image with me, this remarkable self-portrait by the artist Sofonisba Anguissola, the first internationally renowned woman artist in history. She was working in the 1500s. What a strange setup for a self-portrait. And we are, in fact, looking at the same painting in two different states. It was restored about 20 years ago. And during the restoration, they found that not Vigée-Lebrun, Sofonisba Anguissola had made some edits while she was creating the picture and was considering moving the hand that represented her hand to sort of be combined with the hand of the man who's painting her. The end result is this image over here on the right. So you might be thinking, if this is a self-portrait by the woman artist, why is she portraying herself being painted by another person, and a man at that? Well, Anguissola has painted her self-portrait being painted by by her master, by her teacher. So you can think of this as like Anguissola practically saying, this is the artist that kind of brought me to life in this self-portrait. Or perhaps she's sort of saying, my talent has equaled or surpassed my master. I think you can kind of read it both ways. In either event, in either way, I think it's a really fascinating image. And I mean, I I would never think to create my own self-portrait being created by someone else. So now we're going to turn our attention back to Rembrandt for a moment. And I've paired Rembrandt here with the French Impressionist Bert Morisot. I think both of these self-portraits are very painterly. You get the sense of like the freedom of the brushwork here. This is a later Rembrandt self-portrait where we can see he still has his palette kind of resting on his forearm here, but now it's as though those brushes are like extensions of his body. They sort of operate like his fingers. They seem to be kind of pointing at his heart here. He also has those two circles in the background. Art historians have loved to debate about these circles. For the most part, we understand them as an expression of great artistry, true genius. Only a great artist could make two freehand circles that look so perfectly circular. There's kind of like a story dating back to antiquity about that kind of talent. So that's what we think those circles are for the most part. Over here with Bert Morisot's self-portrait, she's a little bit younger. She's in her 40s here. And we can see there's like this frenzy, this fluttering of her brush all over this canvas, adding in these wonderful brush strokes with so much energy. And I just love the way she suggested her brush and her hand in this painting with just a couple of quick brush strokes. But then there seems to be almost like this tornado, this little spiral of energy. And you get the sense that she's captured herself mixing up her paints on her palette here. So two really great examples of the artist and the palette kind of coming together. I have one last peek into the artist's studio. This is a rare and unusual example of Romare Bearden's self-portraits. This one is a later work. It's from 1981. The artist would die just a few years later in 1988 at the age of 76. So it's kind of a late in life, kind of, maybe examination of his place, not only in the studio, but in the art world. So we can barely see him here. Now, Romare Bearden is a painter, but probably best known for his collages. So we get a lot of that collage element in this image with the flooring and the fabrics that have been added in. But the artist himself is standing by his easel. There's a work on the easel, and he's wrapped his arm around it, as though it's like an old friend. The face of the artist is so hard to read. It almost looks indistinguishable. I'm going to see if I can kind of zoom in on it for you here, because there is, in fact, like a pencil line drawing of a face. But clearly, to Bearden at this moment, that is like the least interesting part, or at least the part that he doesn't want to reveal about his studio setting here. So it's the identity as an artist. It's that peek into the studio that is most important to him. So now we're going to turn our attention to other kinds of objects that have been important to artists over the years. We're going to start off with another one of my favorites, Giuseppe Arcimboldo, the Renaissance era artist who's best known for these composite head portraits. And they are wild, aren't they? This is one of his most famous works. It's a painting of Vertumnus, who was the Roman god of seasons and change, represented here by this amalgamation of like flowers and leaves and fruits and vegetables all kind of coming together. It creates this whimsical and slightly unsettling human likeness here. This is not a self-portrait by Arcimboldo, who, as I understand it, was generally considered a madman during his lifetime. Let's see what happens when Arcimboldo creates an image of himself. How wild is it going to be? Well, at first glance, it seems pretty tame, right? It seems fairly straightforward. There's no fruits or vegetables popping out of his head. But if we zoom in just a little bit closer, he's done something kind of wonderful here. Arcimboldo has created this work on paper, and so he is using paper as his significant or symbolic object here because his face, every wrinkle, his hair, and even his clothing, all of it is seems to be made up out of little rolled sheets of paper, and it's just such an unusual and I think visually compelling likeness. I couldn't leave it out of today's program. It's a wonderful one, isn't it? Now, thinking about symbolic objects, this is like the ultimate symbolic self-portrait or image with symbolic elements with it. So we're looking again at another Dutch Baroque image. The artist here is named Bailey. This is from 1651 and it's called Self-Portrait with Vanitas Symbols. So vanitas, of course, is this art historical term that essentially means remember you must die. So you have to live a good and holy life on this earth in order to, enjoy heaven in the great beyond. So a vanitas is essentially still life elements that remind you of our transitory nature on this planet. And there's all these vanitas elements on the table here, the skull being the most obvious, but the fact that at the very center of the composition, there's a candle that has just been extinguished. There are all these bubbles in the air. We know they're just going to pop because time goes on, right? We even have wilting flowers over here, a little floral still life. Now, all these great trompe l'oeil elements, and then the artist himself. But he, in fact, is the biggest vanitas object of them all because the artist was in his 60s when he painted this. This is in fact his real likeness when he accomplished this painting. And so he's included an image of his likeness from decades earlier as another reminder of the transitory nature of life on this planet. I think it's brilliant. It's really unusual. So, okay. Our next image is one that was made a little bit closer to home. This is done by the artist Charles Wilson Peale. He is standing here in a museum that he founded in the 1700s. He's an artist that was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, who then went on to paint all of these significant figures from the Revolution, including George Washington, and then kind of divided his interests in the sciences and in the arts, and pursued each field rapidly, and was able to combine those interests in this museum, which was the Philadelphia Museum, also known as Peale's Museum. He created this life-size self-portrait at the age of 81. This painting's at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts down in Pennsylvania. It's worth the trip. So Charles Wilson Peale is telling us every significant object in his life with this picture. He's lifting the curtain to reveal it to us. So just beyond him are the bones of a mastodon, which was he himself was involved in excavating. We can also see all of these cabinets of birds here that he was involved in taxidermying himself. This is his taxiderming kit in the foreground, and then painted portraits along the top of the museum. And then, of course, he includes his painter's palette and his brushes here to underscore the importance of his identity as an artist. So everything that is most important to him is surrounding him in this scene. Tells us a lot about who Charles Wilson Peale is. I love the look on his face and the way he kind of beckons us in. Come learn about me, right? Now, the artist Marc Chagall, the modern master here, was known to include all of his favorite things in so many of his pictures. Over the course of his 75-year-long career, he developed this set of personally significant symbols, usually like barnyard animals that reference his childhood in Russia, the Eiffel Tower, which we can kind of well, I think we can surmise that that's probably the Eiffel Tower there, which represented his kind of artistic flowering as a young man in Paris. And then very often he loved to paint brides too. So we have this sort of doll-sized bride flying through the air and leaning up against the artist's head here. So he would combine these elements, these symbols, in kind of logic defying and gravity denying compositions like this one. If you take those symbols out, we have a pretty straightforward self-portrait here. It's the artist in three-quarter profile, bust length self-portrait. We've got his palette, maybe some brushes here, and the edge of his canvas. But then he's included this whimsical view of Paris itself, a giant rooster sitting on his head, and this bride flying through the air. So really what he's giving us here is like what's on his mind, but truly what's in his heart. There's a little smile playing at the edge of his lips here, and you always get that sense of joy in Marc Chagall's self-portraits, in most of his paintings too, I would say. You don't get the same feeling necessarily when you look at a Frida Kahlo self-portrait. This is a self-portrait from 1940. And this is one that she painted right around the time of her divorce from another renowned artist, Diego Rivera. So we can see so much of the physical and emotional pain that Frida Kahlo endured throughout her life in a self-portrait like this. Here she presents herself frontally. We have these kind of subtle suggestions and connections back to religious art. She kind of reminds me of a religious icon here, but she's also wearing a necklace of thorns. It reminds me of the crown of thorns, and that thorny necklace is actually drawing blood. So so these Christian overtones are certainly there, and art historians think that the butterflies and the dragonflies are included to kind of reference resurrection too. And if she's just gone through a divorce, I mean, there's the pain and then there's the hope of coming out better on the other side. Then there are these strange creatures around her, right? There seems to be a dead hummingbird hanging from that necklace. Art historians have interpreted that in a wide varieties of ways. I've read everything from it's a symbol of war. Okay, that works for a divorce, right? Or it's a symbol to sort of suggest she's open to new love. It's a strange way to say it, but maybe that works too. And then she's got the black cat and the spider monkey here over her shoulders. And most art historians connect those animals back to indigenous symbolism from Mexico. But the little monkey is sometimes read as a symbolic representation of Frida Kahlo's husband, her ex-husband, because in this case, he is actually pulling on that crown of thorn or the necklace of thorns, I should say. He is the source of the physical pain here that she is enduring. So that, I mean, that could be a nice connection back to what she was feeling around the heartache of getting divorced in this case. So one last image related to personally significant or symbolic elements. And this is an unusual self-portrait. It's done by the artist Andrew Wyeth. It's done in 1951 and it's called Trodden Weed. What we're looking at here are the hills of Chaddsford, Pennsylvania, which is where Andrew Wyeth grew up. He had this idyllic childhood. He was raised by another artist in a family of artists, and he was really selected by his own father to be like the heir apparent to this artistic dynasty. So he was kind of his father's favorite. And just a few years before Andrew Wyeth painted this picture, his father had sort of unexpectedly passed away, a very violent death where his father's car was seemingly stuck on some train tracks and a train came and ended his life. So what we see here is not the artist's face, not Andrew Wyeth's face. There's no sign of that grief, but what we do see, what he is willing to reveal in this picture is that he's wearing these big old leather boots. He's walking around the hills of his childhood wearing these big old leather boots. And they didn't actually belong to him. They didn't belong to his father even. They belonged to his father's art teacher, a man by the name of Howard Pyle. So here is Andrew Wyeth kind of processing the grief of losing his father, losing his mentor, and he's channeling it through this like artistic lineage that he was a part of. So he's just choosing to only show those legs, those boots. It's an extension of the self. It's his connection back to the past. It's his expression of grief here. Really interesting choices. So now we are going to turn our attention fully to expression, to emotion, and think about how artists have used the self-portrait in particular as a platform to explore emotion. And, you know, I always love to start with joy, and it always goes back to Judith Leister for me. Such an unusual self-portrait because it was unusual for a woman to be a professional artist back in the 1600s. So here we can see this young woman, a successful artist in her time, painting at a canvas, another kind of joyful figure here, but also presenting herself to the world at a time when images of joy and spontaneity were kind of all the rage. So that's what she gives us here. She is leaning her arm back on her chair as though we've just surprised her by walking into her studio. And she's got this warm, ebullient expression on her face. And I'm going to zoom in. I mean, you can see her teeth in this picture. This is pretty unusual in the history of art. You don't see a lot of teeth. So you really do get this wonderful sense of warmth and joy as you look at her self-portrait here. And like I said, it's underscored by the image that she has decided to include in her self-portrait as well. Now, for the most part, joy is not necessarily the expression that many artists are exploring in their self-portraits. But this next image is pretty unusual. I really get a kick out of this one. It's from about the same time period, the 1600s. It's the Dutch Baroque. The artist's name is Joos van Cresbeek, and this is a presumed self-portrait that's known as The Smoker. I kind of can't believe that images of this aren't reproduced and in every college dorm room around, right? Because we have an image of this wide-eyed, sort of crazy-looking guy with wild hair here. And of course, his mouth is pressed into this oval. We can tell he's pushing the smoke out of his lungs. So we get this little tendril of white smoke in front of him that connects with the still lit pipe. And then notice this, he has got this glass bottle kind of clutched to his chest. We can only presume that there's booze in there, right? So a pretty unusual picture. This might fall under the category of like a tronie from around this time, similar to like the girl with the pearl earring. Tronies were ways for artists to explore either exaggerated expression or something that was kind of exotic. So this would make sense for this artist in particular. He never aspired to create portraits of rich and powerful people. Instead, his bread and butter were images of lower class people kind of carousing in taverns. So if you're going to create a self-portrait, why not practice on, you know, the kind of image that you might include in a later painting? It's really fun and unexpected, right? Now, this next scene or this next slide also very unexpected. These are two self-portraits by the artist Joseph de Creux, French artist working in the late 1700s, and he brought a certain theatricality to his self-portraits, didn't he? He would depict himself with these exaggerated facial expressions, these unconventional poses, these theatrical gestures here that oftentimes emphasized emotion over decorum. I can imagine he wanted to explore all of these feelings, but probably didn't have any sort of willing friends who would ham it up for him in the same way that he was looking to do this. Now, he would use this self-portrait format to explore these authentic human emotions, but in a rather silly way. There's something so wonderfully playful about this, right? And it just seems staged. So they do they do defy convention in every way, but there's there's a whimsy to them. And these aren't the only ones. This is just part of a set. And I think about 10 years or so ago, they all became very popular memes on the internet too. So he kind of opens the door, he kind of sets the stage for other artists to explore extreme emotion too in their paintings. Brings us to one of my favorites, Gustave Courbet's The Desperate Man from the mid 1800s. This is an arresting image, isn't it? It's those wide eyes. It's like we can all imagine raking our fingers through our hands, our elbows up like this. Notice this is a horizontal format as opposed to the vertical format. And there is this immediacy to it. It's like he's in our space. The energy here is sort of ratcheted up by the extreme light and shadow here as well. This is an image that I think creates this kind of stark and extreme emotional environment. But we all have to remember that this is a carefully crafted image. It's not as though the artist turned to a mirror and just adopted this pose and then immediately captured it on canvas. He would have to adopt this pose again and again and again in order to conjure the kind of image that we see here. So it is a careful construction, but it is particularly effective, isn't it? It again sort of opens up the doors for other artists exploring emotion. And of course, next up, we have Vincent van Gogh, whose self portraits are, like every other self portrait, to a certain degree, a construction. But Vincent van Gogh was known for kind of laying bare his emotional landscape in these pictures. He wasn't kind of holding back what he was feeling, how he was operating in the world. And so, what we see in his self portraits, he painted more than 30 of them, is a dramatic change in his own likeness, his own physiognomy, depending on his emotional state. And it's startling to me every single time I look at them, how different he looks in his self portraits, probably not even intentionally trying to look different from one image to the next, but how that translates to what we know of his emotional state at the time. And so Vincent van Gogh's self portrait certainly, again, sort of widened the crack in the door for other artists to explore emotion in their works too. This brings us to the early 20th century artist Egon Schiele. He painted numerous self portraits that are these like extreme psychological and physical examinations. He used these kind of eccentric gestures and these over the top facial expressions to kind of push the boundaries of self representation. Sometimes these were sort of sexualized images too, but he would oftentimes paint his flesh to look cadaverous. He would emphasize like bones and sinews here, and everything is kind of like an exaggerated proportion. So through these uncomfortable kind of theatrical poses and these distorted figures, we have Sheila himself transforming his likeness in his self portraits. He's moving from like the sense of like self portrait as documentation to more of like a psychological landscape here. So his body becomes this vehicle for expressing anxiety and sexuality and mortality. It's all wrapped into one here. Okay, one last artist expressing emotion. I love Cindy Sherman. And these are two images from her Untitled Film Still series from the 1970s. And in that series, she basically looked at like film noir, film from like the 1950s and 60s, and these archetypal female characters. So then she would create a photograph where she was the model, the makeup artist, the hairstylist, and the costume designer, and she would inhabit these kind of female archetypes in her photographs. She would be the first person to say that these are not self-portraits, but of course, she's the subject. So, how do we understand them? Instead, I think we can look at them and sort of understand them as a reflection of our world, more so than a reflection of who she was. So what does it say about our world that we see these two kind of vulnerable women in these extreme situations in these images? Very powerful. So in the interest of time, we're moving right along. A few images, a few self-portraits hiding in plain sight. You know, we had to do the Arnolfini double portrait in this program. The famous image from the early 1400s, the mysterious image where we see this couple with their hands conjoined together here at the center of the composition. And just beyond them is another one of these convex mirrors. We started off with them tonight. And if we zoom into this convex mirror, which is just a tiny portion of what is already a modestly sized canvas, we can see this extraordinary amount of detail. We can see the back of the man and the woman we just saw. We can see the reflection of the space that they inhabit, and the suggestion through blue and red here that there are two other people in the room. We're going to get in even closer here. Perhaps one of those people who would have been standing where we're standing as viewers, perhaps one of those people is actually the artist himself. That, I think, is really the key to the continued fascination with this remarkable piece of art. I mean, those little slashes of color, the red and the blue there are tiny. They're smaller than your fingernail, but it's that path of discovery and the aha moment of seeing it that I think always brings people back to this image. And it has inspired some copycats over the years. About 100 years later, we have the artist Quentin Matsys, who created the painting The Money Changer and His Wife. This is at the Louvre Museum, and it has this incredible still life in the foreground. And you've probably already spotted the little convex mirror right there, right? So who's in the mirror? It's probably the artist. We can't confirm it, but it's somebody sitting there reading a book with their hand up on the edge of the window there. You don't have that same kind of search and aha moment with the money changer and his wife, but it's still a nice little artist trick in this picture. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Raphael's painting, The School of Athens, where he has created this imagined scene of all of the greatest thinkers from throughout humanity, throughout time, combined together on the steps of this kind of idealized um, classical temple here. And right at the center, we have Plato and Aristotle sort of in the midst of a debate, and all of these great mathematicians and scientists surrounding them. So why wouldn't Raphael want to include himself in this painting? I mean, this is really good company. And here he is, his little face looking out at us. Of course, he wants to be remembered among the best thinkers of all time. I think it's just a great choice on his part to include himself in this picture. So he will be forever associated with the greatest thinkers of humanity. Now, just down the way from where this is painted, you have Michelangelo, who painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling and the west wall of that same chapel. This is his Last Judgment painting that he did very late in his life. Well, he was in his 60s, which was considered very elderly at the time. And here he is climbing up all the scaffolding. He definitely didn't think that he was the right person for this job. There was a lot of angst going along with this commission. But here we can see this heavenly realm where in the Last Judgment you have Jesus and Mary surrounded by saints and martyrs. And of course, many of these martyrs are identifiable because they've been depicted with the instruments of their martyrdom. So if somebody's been crucified, they might be shown with a cross. In this case, this is St. Bartholomew down here, who's holding a knife because he was sadly flayed alive. He was skinned to death. And Michelangelo portrayed St. Bartholomew holding his own skin in this picture. And this is sort of universally accepted to be a self-portrait of Michelangelo, probably one of the most psychologically complex and disturbing self-portraits in art history, suggesting themes of like spiritual torment and artistic suffering, and perhaps maybe some concern about his own salvation. Got one last grisly self-portrait for you here. Moving on to the artist from the 1600s, the bad boy of art history, Caravaggio. We were looking at him earlier this year, and this is painting that he did of David and Goliath. And at this point, the little young shepherd boy David has already taken down the Goliath with his slingshot and has at this point beheaded the giant. Now, the bad boy of art history, who had himself already killed a man, was perhaps thinking about his own salvation and worried about the future of his own head in painting his own likeness on the grisly decapitated head of Goliath here. It's a really sort of upsetting and grotesque image. And it is so far away from the kind of self-portrait I think any of us would ever consider making. We generally think of a self-portrait as an opportunity to kind of, shine up your image and look your best. And here is Caravaggio um, presenting himself as the defeated villain, as the worst of the worst here. You can think of this as like self-destruction and penitence kind of all rolled into one. We're going to end this section with something that is much lighter and a lot more fun. This is a work by the artist Clara Peters, a Dutch Baroque artist. And and here she's given us cheese and pretzels and almonds. This is from 1615. And if you're looking for a self-reflection in the cheese, you're not looking in the right place. I love this picture. It's such a great little palette cleanser, right? Clara Peters has captured with fidelity every aspect of this still life here, from the little nick in the table, the knife coming out into our space, but it's the reflective surfaces over here is where we find her self-portrait. Here she is actually in the pewter topper of this earthenware jug. There's the detail. You just get the sense of maybe like from her nose up, hidden here in her self-portrait. And this is not the only time she did this. She snuck her self-portrait into more than one painting. This is her still life with flowers and gold cups of honor. This is one of, a rare example of a signed and dated self-portrait. You can just make it out down here. She was really proud of this work. It's sort of like its own little cabinet of curiosities here. You might be thinking, where is the hidden self-portrait? Look at this. Here it is in these kind of curved facets on this ornate goblet here. There's several little hidden self-portraits, and they are just delightful. So she's going to make you want to zoom in on every shiny object and every still life you see from now on. But what a great way to immortalize yourself, right? And that is what self-portraiture is all about. So we are going to end with age and mortality here. One of the most compelling self-portraits, I think, about age and mortality is Arnold Böcklin's self-portrait with Death Playing the Fiddle from 1872. What an interesting setup here, right? It's as though the mirror is the canvas itself. The artist is hard at work, kind of confronting his own likeness, also in the act of painting. And it's though he's been distracted by just the softest sound. And yet here is this grinning, grimacing face of death right behind him with this fiddle. And notice this, the fiddle only has one string. And I forget what string it is. Somebody just told me the other day, I think it's like, is it the F or the G? But they said it's the lowest note and it's like the ground. It's known as the ground. So we can only imagine what that sounds like to listen to that fiddle here. So Böcklin has tied in creativity and mortality into one painting that I think will haunt everybody for all eternity. Here is Picasso's self-portrait, known as Picasso Staring Down Death. This is one of his last works at the age of 90. It's 1972. And here he has the skull-like image, this kind of ghastly green pallor here. And look at the eyes. I mean, it's like he's going into another dimension, staring down what death actually looks like in this wild and stylized, abstracted self-portrait here. Andy Warhol is probably feeling something sort of similar in this self-portrait. He certainly didn't know that he would die fairly early or just a few months after he created this self-portrait, But he did a whole series where he's wearing what was known as his fright wig, where it's standing straight up, it's way oversized. You can tell it's a wig here. And so we have this man who is kind of famously conscious of his own image and his appearance, um, kind of creating this image of a disembodied head, this kind of skull like face floating there in the darkness. It seems as though he's confronting his own mortality in an image like this one. And of course, just the idea of wearing a wig here too is like trying to delay death or deny aging to a certain extent. So another haunting image. But we're going to leave off with Alice Neel and her very brave and spectacular self-portrait, nude self-portrait at the age of 80. Leave it to a woman to think about death and mortality in a really different way. She's depicted herself here honestly, without idealization or shame. There's these bold gestures here, the very pink cheeks. She and I always have that in common. Um, but this work, I think, is just this radical departure from everything that came before it. I mean, here's Alice Neel saying, I reject ageism, I reject sexism. There is no one right way for a woman's body to look. And so we end on that high note today. We'll do just a very quick conclusion here to wrap up a couple of big ideas. Tonight's presentation has allowed us to explore the mechanics of representation when it comes to a self-portrait, that fascinating dynamic between artist and mirror and the canvas. And we've seen joy and horror and everything in between as artists tried to render their interior worlds and reflections of the world around them. I love this combination here, just legs really, right? We've seen the very careful accounting on the part of the artist in terms of just how much they are willing to reveal, both physically and psychologically. And we've been drawn in by their penetrating gazes, their playfulness, and their naked vulnerability. Self-portraits are often as close as we can get to a conversation with the artist, and they remind us that beneath the layers of time and technique, we share the fundamental human experience of trying to understand who we are and how we fit into the world around us. Thank you. Went a little bit long tonight. I apologize for that. I'm going to start taking a look at the Q&A. Let's see if I can answer any of your questions that you might have. Oh, Joe, you're so sweet. He says upcoming events, and he has pinned my calendar here. So anybody who wants to know what is coming up next, please feel free to go to the iamculturallycurious.com/calendar page. Next month's program is on American palaces, Biltmore, and Vizcaya. So I might be saving you a trip down south if you join us. An anonymous attendee says, in the Dali work, is it possible that Galo's face is unresolved because the portrait that Dali is painting isn't finished? I'm so happy you mentioned that. That's like another whole dimension to that work of art, and I didn't even really touch on that. So the painting on Dali's canvas was still empty, right? So it is bringing up this whole idea of like uh, of whether or not the artist chooses to show something on their canvas. In this case, he hasn't, and really what's on his canvas is in many ways what we see in the reflection. It's a fascinating triangulation there. Thank you for raising that subject because it's such a great point. M. David says, did Rockwell use a photograph to help him paint his triple self-portrait, especially his back? Great question. I'm assuming he did, but off the top of my head, I don't think I've ever seen that photo. If anybody else has, please let me know. He did a number of paintings of artists over the course of his career that show artists from behind that way, even when it wasn't him. So it's a setup that he really came to like, and it works really well because people always love to look over an artist's shoulder to see what they're doing, right? But now I'll be on the lookout for that Rockwell photograph. You'd think that would be kicking around. Let's see if anybody can find it. Great question, David. Thank you. Mary, thanks for being here tonight. She says, what is Estes trying to say by having one of the trees grow right out of the top of his head. Mary, I hadn't even noticed. Let's see if we can find it here. That is really interesting. It's almost like he's giving himself antlers here, right, Mary? Um, off the top of my head, I'm not sure if there's a deeper meaning to that. I mean, I think we could have fun drawing associations and that sort of thing, but everything about photorealism to me seems so literal that I'm not sure that there's a deeper meaning to it per se. Maybe I'm selling Estes a little bit short by that, but Mary, if you've got ideas, I'd love to hear them. Um, Carla says, was Rembrandt a portly man? It sort of seems like as he grew up, he gained a few pounds around the middle and around the face a little bit. I think you can see that a little bit in the self-portrait with the two circles in the background. I think, oh, there we go. And Francine says, to me, Rembrandt's circle on the right has a slight three-dimensional quality. Interesting. Similar to a very flat pillow stuffed with feathers or cotton. Well, that's fascinating, Francine. I love thinking of it in a whole new way. And now I'm thinking about like all these curved mirrors that we're looking at too. So the idea of that being a three-dimensional surface all of a sudden becomes really intriguing. She says, in the same frame that you showed Ava Lebrun, Vigie Lebrun, I think, the other painter painted another figure beside himself. I love the three-dimensional quality of the figure painted within the frame. Trompe l'oeil. I agree, Francine. Isn't that a knockout of a painting right there? That self-portrait with the artist patron. It looks as though they could have a conversation. It looks so three-dimensional. It is a wonderful to kind of trompe l'oeil element to make it seem like two people sitting in the same room as opposed to an artist painting on a two-dimensional surface. An anonymous attendee says the self-portrait of Frida Kahlo appears to have male facial hair. What is the significance of that? Thank you for asking. I usually kind of fill that in whenever I'm looking at a Frida Kahlo picture. She does play up the unibrow. She did have a unibrow. She certainly plays up the mustache in a lot of her self-portraits. And my best way of understanding this was it was Frida Kahlo kind of defying expectations of women at the time. It was also a great way to get attention. And to a certain degree, you still see women today kind of doing the same thing. I remember back a few years ago, there was like an Instagram famous model who had the Frida Kahlo kind of eyebrows and had 500,000 followers. So if you look a little different, you get noticed. And I think that's a big part of it. But I'm not exactly what term you would necessarily use for her sexual orientation or gender identity today, but that could certainly play a part in it today as well, because she did have lesbian relationships in addition to being married to a man. So it's all kind of built into that. But thank you for asking because I didn't even touch on that. Linda says, in the first self-portrait, the round one with the young artist in the hand in the foreground, could he be holding a mirror in his hand to see himself painting the image? Let's go look at that. That could be the case. Let's see. It's hard to know exactly what is in his hand, right? So are you sort of thinking like maybe like a handheld mirror? It could be the case. I think those little convex mirrors were things that didn't necessarily have handles on them, as far as I've seen, but maybe could have. Usually, the hands if in an artist's self-portrait are there to kind of speak to like the exercise of creativity, the fascination with creativity. But you could probably kind of interpret what's going on with his hands in a number of ways because there's a lack of clarity there. So Linda, thanks for offering up that question. Um, Joe, if there's something that you want to say, I think because we're in webinar mode, I think you just have to write it out. But thanks for your interest in wanting to share things. You could add it to the Q&A if you'd like. Sharon says, is Norman Rockwell sitting on a red pillow or is that paint? Let's go and check. I think it's red. He uses red so effectively. Yes, that is like a little red cushion. And I have another program that's all about color and art. I include this image in it because he uses red. It's like he's seasoning his picture with some red just to move our eye throughout this composition. And he does that so well, just a little bit of red underneath his seat there. Mary says, I bet Estes did that placement deliberately. It's so dramatic, so obvious. It must be on purpose. Maybe something about his mind being the ground from which life emerges, something about the force of his creativity. Mary, I love that interpretation. We're going to do a deep dive on Estes next year. He's part of the lineup. We're going to do photorealism and Chuck Close. So we'll be on the lookout for that. Maybe at that point, Mary, I'll have a little bit more insight into this one. But thank you so much for sharing that interpretation. I love it. I think we got, oh, okay. I think we got to the end of those questions, and I'm seeing feedback over here in the chat as well. Frank Cronson is here. Thanks always for joining us, Frank. Somebody says Chagall included the rooster as a tribute to France, his adopted country. The rooster is a symbolic France as the eagle is to the US. Thank you so much for adding that. I always thought that was a reference to like to the livestock that he normally includes in so many of his pictures. Thanks for adding that. And let's see. Just very nice things that people are saying. And I'm going to copy and paste all of this so I can read everything. I really appreciate everybody's kindness and their feedback and your willingness to share things with me because you always help me learn too. It's always fun. Thank you again, everybody, for sharing your evening with me. And I look forward to seeing you next month when we cover these American palaces. We'll all feel like we are very rich for an evening, right? Thanks again, everybody. Have a great night and stay cool. See you soon.